I want to begin with a question. What do you think it means to say a person's heterosexual in the United States today? Prior to taking this course, you might have simply responded that it means to exhibit sexual attraction towards the opposite sex. And after the first few weeks of this course, as we've talked about sexual identities and orientations, you might have added to that definition, saying it's to exhibit sexual attraction towards the opposite sex, regardless of if the aim is for pleasure, procreation, love, or marriage. But as we've seen in the last few weeks, it can be even more complicated than that. You might be surprised to know that heterosexuality is understudied and undertheorized within the field of sexuality studies. Despite the fact that it's the benchmark of sexual interactions in our society today, there's little research on heterosexual identities or heterosexuality as an orientation. We do know that many people today think of heterosexuality as an identity, similar to being Jewish, Italian, or German. And therefore, it becomes part of how people present themselves to the world. In this mini lecture, we'll look at sexual identities, specifically heterosexual identities. And we'll look at the complications and complexities of heterosexual identities by thinking about heterosexuality not only within the context of the United States, but all over the globe. To further unpack the complexities of heterosexual identities, we'll look at a few cross-cultural cases. Just as a reminder, in this course we use cross-cultural examples as a means of illustrating the diversity of ways in which people understand sex and sexuality, and never as a means of othering. So to begin, let's return to the Sambia of Papua New Guinea that we discussed in last week's mini lecture. As you may recall, the Sambia engage in a coming-of-age ritual where young boys between 7 and 10 years old must go through a series of tests of endurance and strength. In addition, these boys also engage in the practice of male insemination, where they perform fellatio on older adolescents and young men. The Sambia believe that young boys must ingest semen, also known as the life force, if they want to become brave, strong, and ultimately masculine men. I explained that members of this tribe all identify as heterosexual. In fact, when asked if there were any gay or homosexual individuals that were part of the society, the members of the Sambia that were interviewed by Gilbert Hurt said that those concepts didn't even exist in their culture. Hurt, who thought that as a self-identified gay man, he'd be able to use his status as a means of engaging in rapport with the Sambia, was surprised to learn that the Sambia couldn't even conceptualize the idea of two adult men or two adult women being in a paired partnership. In fact, the Sambia believed that the act of performing fellatio by boys on another man did not make one homosexual, given that for the Sambia, this act was non-sexual in nature, but rather a means of ingesting the life force necessary for boys to transition into full adult manhood. Another example of how understandings of heterosexuality can vary by culture comes from the third largest city in Brazil, Salvador. In Salvador, there are nearly 200 travestis, a subset of sex workers. The word travesti is derived from the Portuguese verb meaning cross-dress. However, travestis did not only cross-dress, they also adapt feminine names, clothing styles, hairstyles, cosmetic practices, and linguistic pronouns. In addition, travestis sometimes ingest large amounts of female hormones and even inject industrial silicone directly into their bodies in order to acquire feminine body features such as breasts, wider hips, larger thighs, and a more expansive buttocks. But despite all this, travestis do not self identify as women. They do not wish to remove their penis and they do not consider themselves to be women. In addition, travestis do not consider themselves to be transgender, despite the title of Don Kulik's book. Rather, they identify as having male homosexual subjectivity and female physical attributes. Don Kulik, who did research among the travestis, found that travestis' boyfriends were a continual and central consideration in the lives of the travestis he interviewed. Boyfriends took up an enormous amount of a travesti's time, thoughts, talk, and money because travestis supported their boyfriends who generally didn't work. While travestis would say that yes, they are homosexual men, they have a male homosexual subjectivity, they would argue that their boyfriends are heterosexual. Males, they believed, make themselves into men by penetrating their partners. And since their boyfriends were always the penetrating partner, they were heterosexual. While travestis frequently enjoyed penetrating other men while they were at work or when a gay man made himself available, they would definitely expel any boyfriend who requested to be penetrated at home. So in this case, penetration was what made the travestis' boyfriends heterosexual. More recently, Gregory Mitchell engaged in research on gay tourism in Brazil and found a similar phenomenon among the garotos that worked in Brazilian sauna. In his research, Mitchell found that gay tourists came to the sauna of Brazil seeking a masculine and heterosexual garoto. In addition, Mitchell found that most of the garotos identified as being heterosexual. They preferred to be the penetrating actor when engaging with gay tourists, but of course, given that sexual interactions was how they made their money, they were open to negotiation. These men identified as heterosexual given that they had sexual relationships with women outside of work. And despite the fact that many times they had long-term relationships with their clients, in some cases even being put up in houses and luxury apartments by their clients and given an allowance as well as luxurious gifts, because of the fact that this was all done within the context of work, they were comfortable identifying as heterosexual. However, there's far less scholarship on the complexities of women's heterosexual identities, either in a domestic or cross-cultural context. In part, this might be because within our society, we allow women much more flexibility in terms of same-sex interactions, even if they identify as being heterosexual. And this is especially true if the women involved in same-sex interactions are appropriately gendered. Despite the diversity of ways in which people identify as heterosexual and the complexities that can exist within heterosexual identities, in our society, we continue to have a very myopic understanding of heterosexuality. And this nearsighted and limited understanding of what it means to be heterosexual is the benchmark of sexual interactions in our society. In 2010, Stephen Siegman, the author of our textbook, published an article on how heterosexual individuals projected their heterosexual identity without ever directly stating they were heterosexual. Siegman argues that as LGBTQIA individuals have become more accepted and more visible in mainstream society, some heterosexual people have found it necessary to project their heterosexuality in ways that were never seen in the past. One of the ways Seidman said heterosexual individuals do this is by distancing themselves from any association with homosexuality. Seidman views this as a type of homophobia. Another tactic was to engage in aggressive heterosexual behavior, such as discussing the opposite sex in romantic or sexual language. In addition, Seidman said individuals may mention past or present opposite sex partners or restrict contact with gay men and lesbians. For example, it's fine to go out to work with your gay or lesbian coworker, but not necessarily to go to the club together after work. We'll end this mini lecture with a few questions from the Heterosexual Questionnaire, which was attributed to Martin Rochlin in 1977. Many LGBTQIA people find themselves put into situations where they feel they have to defend their sexuality. And this can be incredibly stressful if a person feels they have to justify their private sexual lifestyle. So, to help non LGBTQIA people understand what the situation feels like, a questionnaire was devised, and it's based on heterophobic premises rather than the homophobic premises which exist chronically in our society. So, if you identify as heterosexual, please try to answer the following questions as honestly as possible. And it's going to be hard. That's the whole point. If you don't identify as heterosexual, consider what it feels like to hear these questions framed in this way. 1. What do you think caused your heterosexuality? 2. When and how did you first decide you were a heterosexual? 3. Is it possible that your heterosexuality stems from a neurotic fear of others of the same sex? 4. Is it possible that your heterosexuality is just a phase you may grow out of? 5. Is it possible that all you need is a good gay lover? 6. Heterosexuals have histories of failure in gay relationships. Do you think you may have turned to heterosexuality out of fear of rejection? 7. If you've never slept with a person of the same sex, how do you know you wouldn't prefer that? 8. If heterosexuality is normal, why are a disproportionate number of mental patients heterosexual? 9. To whom have you disclosed your heterosexual tendencies? How did they react? 10. Your heterosexuality doesn't offend me, so long as you don't force it on me. Why do you people feel compelled to seduce others into your sexual orientation? The heterosexual questionnaire goes on. There's 24 questions in total. And if you really took this questionnaire seriously, right now you might be feeling a little bit defensive or even a little bit ashamed. The questionnaire was designed so that heterosexual folks could have a better understanding of some of the questions that are frequently presented to LGBTQIA individuals. It also illustrates sexual power dynamics that exist within the context of our society. So, in closing, you might consider the following questions, regardless of your sexual identification. Do you find some of the questions hard to answer? Which ones, and what made it so difficult? How did the questions make you feel? What does the questionnaire say about our society that gay, lesbian, and bisexual folks are asked similar questions? And what can you do in the future if you hear someone asking these types of questions?